I was like, that's it. That's what I'm going to do at art school.
It wasn't nearly as an established profession as it is now.
I had more of this interactive design background, which was unique at that time.
In some ways, you were working on things that were a little bit fringe.
It was scary. If you don't put yourself out there, you won't know what type of work you could get. I'd never worked anywhere that had more than 8 or 9 people working there, and 3,000 people work there. Anything just felt like it took so much energy. You don't feel like you have enough time for yourself.
That's a very different person. How did you develop that awareness?
I made a lot of changes to help me make it through this next phase of my career. I want to continue helping more designers through their burnouts and career pivots. I'd say just do it and then trust yourself that if it doesn't work, that you'll just figure it out.
What happens when you leave the comfort of your own successful design studio to take on the challenges of leading design at one of the world's most prestigious newspapers? Today's guest, Renda Morton, did just that. And the insights she gained along the way are invaluable for anyone navigating their own career path. From running her own studio in New York to leading major design projects at the New York Times and Dropbox, Renda's seen it all. But what drove her to make such bold moves? And how did she manage to avoid burnout while balancing such high-stakes roles? I'm your host, Chris Abad, and this is Pixelated Path. In this episode, we dive into Renda's story, how she transitioned from the fast-paced world of small studios to the structured environment of the corporate world, and what it takes to really thrive in both. If you're curious about the realities behind these career leaps and how to maintain your creative energy along the way, this conversation's for you. But before we jump in, don't forget, subscribe to Pixelated Path so you never miss an episode filled with inspiring stories and actionable insights. Let's get started with Renda Morton's incredible journey. Renda, thanks for joining the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, cool. Let's just jump right in. And what I'd like to do is maybe just go back to the very beginning. Tell us how you first got interested in design and in this whole career.
I really wanted to go to art school when I was in high school, but I didn't know what I was going to do there. So it wasn't until I got to art school, and the school I went to, MCAD, the first year is kind of like a Bauhaus program where you do a little bit of everything. Like you do sculpture and painting and design and photography. So it was through that I learned about design and specifically digital design. And I was like, that's it. That's what I'm going to do at art school.
How did you know that you wanted to go to art school? Was there something did you have people in your family that went to art school?
I was so young because I graduated high school when I was 16. I graduated a year early because I also knew I didn't want to be in high school anymore, but I don't ask me why. I can't go back and figure out why I really was so motivated to leave high school and go to art school. I know, I think I love learning, and I think art school is a type of learning where you're not just reading about something, you're doing something or learning a skill or a craft. And that was super exciting. Most teenagers, I just love music, and it was oh, you can go listen to music and make art or use a computer and listen to music all day.
Nice. Do you remember how you even found out art school was a thing? For me growing up, it took me a while before I realized that was even an option. I didn't know anything about what art school was or how it worked.
Probably through my high school art teachers and taking art class in high school. I don't know. I haven't thought about this in a while.
I wonder how many high school art teachers we have to thank for the current state of our profession. That's how it started for me.
Yeah.
Was finding art classes in high school. Super interesting.
Yeah.
So when you went to art school, you mentioned you were studying digital media, which people may not realize is totally different than what it is today, and maybe the type of work that we do today. But there was enough of maybe a spark to get you interested. What was that like? What were the types of things you studied?
Yes, I started school in the fall of 1999. I think we were making Macromedia Director CD-ROMs, or Flash had just come out and you could animate stuff in the computer lab. I think people were doing motion graphics, and I was really inspired by them. And although I never did any of that, but I don't know, looked really cool.
Yeah, very cool. Okay. So let's jump forward a little bit. And your first job was in Holland at Lust. Do you feel like what what was it like working and living abroad? Like what did you take away from that experience in terms of your design career?
I think because it was my first job, I didn't know how other jobs work, so I kind of went in like a blank slate, like, oh, this is a job, this is how jobs work. So I had more of a transition when I came back to the States and like realized work culture was different. But just living abroad, it doesn't matter where it is, you just gain a different perspective on where you're from or where you had been living before because you're just like so removed from it. So that was a really great experience as well. Or just learning about other cultures, and I got to meet a lot of other like interns from different countries in Europe that would also come to the Netherlands and do their
Hmm.
internships or work at design studios. So I learned a lot about like people from Germany and Switzerland and Portugal, and it was cool.
How do you feel like the perspectives from those different cultures influenced how you approach design?
Hmm. How do I approach design? I know at working at Lust, like they had like their own perspective on design, and they were really like into technology and design and like where it meets. And especially, so I worked there like 2000, 2005, and like technology was just in a different place now. And they also did a lot of work like in the arts and culture space. So it's like their like perspective on design was also kind of like an artistic one, or it was like one where their like voice and point of view was more a part of the work than like the way like a designer, like later on when I worked at big companies, like voice might be a part of it. It was kind of like more of a design and art practice
Hmm.
where they had like clients, but they were like being hired by those clients for their like more their artistic point of view and less like what it does like someone who works in like product design today might be like you're still like it's about your point of view, but it's less in this like artistic realm.
It's really interesting. I certainly feel like you mentioned like when you went to school, there's sort of like that Bauhaus influence, and then being in Holland, like maybe with like especially industrial design, I think like there's a lot of history of like people are sort of known for like their stamp and their personality being put into their design, but it's not. These are like commercial products that also need to be functional,
Mm-hmm.
and I wonder how much of that still exists. Do you feel like you any of that has influenced your work today? Like how much of your own personality do you feel like makes it into your own work?
I felt like when I left that and I went back to the States, and especially when I went to this other phase of my career where I worked at big companies, like my personality and like that stuff would influence like how we approached it, but it wouldn't like come through in like the actual work we were doing because that you kind of get subsumed. Like I worked at the New York Times and that Dropbox, and it's just like that needs to feel like the New York Times and Dropbox,
Mm.
just like the way that we might do it. I felt like that was where that could play.
One thing I wanted to ask earlier that I completely skipped over. So you go to school in the States, you spend a little bit of time in Holland at your first job, and then you come back to the States. How'd you end up in Holland?
I did this program that I'm not sure. I think it might still be running through CCA, the college. No, it's the College of Creative Studies in Detroit,
Mm.
and it's called D Program. And they take American design students or early career designers to Holland for 2 or 3 weeks to deprogram them from their American design education. And when I did the program, we spent like we did a workshop with one studio and then a workshop with Studio Lust, and then you're visiting design studios, or they're just kind of taking you around to like museums and like kind of getting you into the design culture. And that's where I met them. And they just had like constantly like rotating set of interns every 3 months, and they were looking for people more shaped like I was at that time because I I graduated in 2003, and that was the summer I did this program, and I had more of this like interactive like design background, which was kind of unique at that time. Like that was like 21 years ago. And they were looking for more interns with that experience because a lot of their interns had more like graphic design type of experience. So I know we just got along really well, and they asked me if I wanted to do an internship. So I kind of went there just for a couple of weeks, and then because I didn't have a plan for what I was going to do after I did that program, it's like, oh great, I'll just do this. And it was just supposed to be for 3 months, and then they hired me, and then I like stayed for 2 years. So I didn't
Wow.
really plan it, but it just happened.
Did you mostly focus on interactive work while you're there, or did you get an opportunity to do like print or like other mediums?
I mostly did interactive stuff, like some websites, and then we did some like physical interactive installation stuff, like with museums, or there was this arts and technology festival in The Hague where we like did some animations on like a hotel building where each hotel room had a big light and you can like control it, and it's kind of like a lo-fi V screen thing.
Nice. That's awesome. Okay, so you spend a few years in Holland. You get to sort of deprogram and see their design culture. You have other people from around the world coming there, influencing yourself as well. And then you come back to the States. And then that next part of your career, you spend some time at small studios. And the first one you started yourself. And that was Rumors, right?
Yeah. Well, first I worked at some small studios in New York, like at Flat or Projects and Local Projects, which are two different places. And then, like, after that, I kind of was in New York long enough to, like, know enough people in the community to feel confident to.
Did moving to New York have anything to do with like the design industry or what you wanted to do with your career, or was it for another reason? Because there's also like a lot of like rich design culture and just the like professional network there as well.
I say I didn't have a plan when I graduated college, but the only plan I had was like, I'll just move to New York and figure it out. At the time, my mom was living there, so I was like, I could stay in my mom's house till I figure it out. So then, like when I was done with Holland, I'm like, I'll just do that plan because I didn't think of anything else. I ended up living in New York for 13 years, and it's actually the place I've lived the longest. So I wasn't born in New York, but I identify as a New Yorker. I haven't lived anywhere that long. There's just so much going on there, and just being in New York, like all the like arts and culture and like things happening, and it would seem like a great place to be.
Do you, so y- so you've been a few different areas that all have kind of a distinct, I guess, personality when it comes to design and design influence. You were in Detroit, you were in Holland, you were in New York, later you were in Silicon Valley. What's unique about New York? How would you describe, at least at that time, like what the personality of design was there?
In New York,
Hmm.
I don't know that it's so big. It felt like it wasn't a monoculture of design. Like there's lots of different like design cultures. So I guess I can only speak to the ones I participated in. Okay. And I feel like because I came from like a small design studio in Holland, and then like was seeking out other small design studios in New York and had my own one. Like I was kind of a part of that design subculture of like small design studios, but there's lots of other like people that worked at big agencies or big companies or like in other parts of design that it's like New York was big enough that it could have like all those different parts of it. But then there was that real change of like going from like the small design studios into like design becoming more big, like companies having more in-house teams, and product design, like digital product design, actually becoming more of a path for people later on. So I kind of saw that change as well.
It's an interesting point that you make that it's almost like several years into your career where you started seeing digital product design actually become a path, which of course means in the early days when you were studying digital design, when you're doing a lot of interactive work at less, like it wasn't nearly as an established profession as it is now. How, and I know like some of this was, you didn't have a plan. But what was that like? Like you were in some ways you were sort of like working on things that were a little bit fringe. You're sort of probably the minority in a lot of circles because this was still an up and coming profession.
I think early on, like we just made what so many websites. And then there was like a group of like making like weird websites for other like people in like arts and design world. And I feel like Projects did that really well too, of just making a ton of like amazing, like truly weird websites for clients that like wanted interesting things. And like that seems like a really a much smaller like design space nowadays. I do remember whenever the iPad came out, like a week or two after it came out or a month after it came out, like talking with some either potential client or someone that was trying to hire someone for a full-time role that was like, we need an iPad design expert. And I was like, expert, this thing just came out a month ago. Like who? But it just was like people were just trying to like jump on it and be like, oh yeah, no, I'm an expert because I've this has been out for a month. So it like happened really fast when it's like iPhone and iPad and that stuff moved.
Do you did that end up being any like an inflection point for you in your career or your path, like the iPhone or the iPad? Do you feel like that changed anything for you?
I remember, so I was in New York, I was working on a lot of magazines or publishers, or like we had a lot of clients in the publishing space, and the iPad was like a really big deal because I don't know if you remember that era of like iPad magazines and where that was like that was gonna be like the next thing. And so that was definitely a like a wave I rode of like being like, oh, I work in magazines and I know like websites. So like I was like positioned to be like, oh, an iPad magazine, like this person can figure it out. And that's actually how I probably ended up with my job at the Times because we did some like contract work for the New York Times magazine, like the one that comes out on the weekends when they were like, oh, we should be on iPads. And like Adobe had that weird software that was just like cutting giant JPEGs for like,
You just
I
in
don't know
the
if you
page
ever,
flip animation.
yeah, that type of stuff.
I want to come back to New York Times, but before we do that, so you worked at some small agencies and then you started your own rumors. And I think that's really interesting because there are I think a lot of young designers out there even today that aspire to start their own thing but aren't quite sure how to make that jump. It can be really scary. Talk me through what that was like for you going from working for someone else to starting your own thing.
It was scary, especially like in New York. It's like economically scary because you're like, how will this like how do I afford this? Or like I still had a bunch of student loans I was paying off. But I just remember like I kind of like did it slowly where I was working and then it was freelance and like maybe I can just like roll up the freelance into this stuff or also like remember thinking like, well, it's not like starting like a restaurant or another business where I have to like buy a bunch of equipment or inventory. Like I have a computer. I can just get it going. I think the biggest and the like the thing I tell other people thinking about this too is like just tell people you're doing it and like see like what happens then because if you don't kind of put yourself out there and say like, hey, I'm working for myself or I'm a start a studio and I'm looking for clients, like you won't know like what type of work you could get. I feel like I sent when I decided to do it, like just sending an email out, even just deciding to go freelance and like work independently, just kind of emailing people and saying like, hey, I'm doing this. Like a lot of like stuff will come up. Like people will be like, oh, you are? Oh, well then I'll send work your way or I'll do this, which I just didn't know would happen until I like took that step and kind of put that out there.
Did you have anyone in particular during that time that was like a sounding board for you or you felt like was giving you great guidance along the way or was this sort of like entirely on your own?
I rented a desk space with a friend, Andrew Sloat. He's a really amazing designer. He's a really interesting career that you should also have in this podcast. And he had this like space in Dumbo with a bunch of desks, and like people rented out the desks, and it was kind of like a co-working space. And because in New York, you're like, apartment's too small and you can't work out of there. And that kind of became a real, we were all working independently, but that like became a real community. And it was actually two of the other people that were running desks there. Andy and Holly is who I ended up starting the studio with. So I really leaned on like Andrew and Jeff, our artist mate, and all the like community like from that like shared space, just for like support and guidance. And also the small studios I worked at, especially projects, because I deployed what I called the table scraps after working there. If they are too busy or don't want to do something or something's too small for them, like I could take their little table scrap projects, make it work for me.
So certainly running your own studio comes with challenges along the way. Could you share one of the bigger challenges that you had as a business owner and what you learned from it?
I think it's like you have so many choices. Like you can decide like who you work for and who you don't work for and like how the work should be done. But then I don't know if I fully had the confidence to really like own that or like step into that freedom of having the business. I think we learned a lot, like having a lot of clients kind of like walk all over us or like being so like afraid, especially starting out like, oh, can we even have a business? Not asking for enough, like to charge enough money for what things were worth, or like taking on too many things at once, or like working for a client that had red flags that we overlooked because we were just like, well, what if no one else will hire us? It's like operating from this mindset of fear and not from like freedom or confidence. Like getting like realizing that was happening is like getting like the confidence and like taking the risk to like operate in a different way. I think was like a huge like thing of growth.
Could you give me an example of a client that you feel like either had like some serious red flags or maybe ended up walking all over you?
We had this client who had like a an art gallery that was more of like a hobby for them, something they were totally serious about. And I think I realized like we were a lot more serious about the work we were doing and like helping them with the art gallery identity and stuff than they were about it. And they just weren't like fully engaged. And we just never like when that's happening, you should like call it out and be like, hey, you don't seem really engaged. But we were just like, oh, we can just do whatever we want. Everything's cool. And kind of like came it creates problems later on when you're actually like trying to like launch the website or like send something to print and they're like, well, I don't like this. They're like, we have to do this over, where we should have realized it was just they were not paying attention throughout the project.
Did you finish the project or did you end up firing them?
I think we worked on it for a while. I think we just kept going. We didn't know any better.
You were mentioning the times earlier. Let's get back to that. So you, at some point, you transitioned from running your own business. How long was that for?
4 or 5 years.
Wow. Okay. Which is a
It was
great
a while.
run. The
Yeah.
studio continued even after you left, right?
My partner Andy kept working. I think he kept it going for another 5 or 6 years.
If you consider, the success rate of any small business, but like starting an agency for the first time and basically starting something that continues to run for 10 plus years, like I think that's success in and of itself. But so you ended up deciding to leave to like go do something completely different, go work for like, large corporate organization. What was the catalyst for that? Why did you decide to leave?
Yeah. I the design industry was changing. Like I said, like iPad experts were everywhere. And like started my career, I didn't really have there weren't it was so new, like digital design. There weren't a lot of I didn't know like there weren't a lot of paths, or if there were, I didn't know about them. I kind of only and maybe it's because a lot of my instructors at school like had small studios or independent practices, and then that's kind of like the path I went down. And I just thought like, oh, I'll just run the studio forever because that's just like how it is. But it like more like big companies were having in-house teams and like websites and apps, and like digital product design was becoming more of a thing and like a real path. And I was like thinking about that and thinking about like, okay, well, like how have I grown in the studio? And I grew a lot like as a business person, or like how to like navigate clients and relationships. But in design, like I wasn't growing. Like we were kind of doing the same type of projects again. And it was a lot of like redesign, or like make a website, and we would like redesign it or make it. And then like, okay, thank you. And like you walk away. But I'm hearing or like seeing other designers like work more iteratively on their designs, and like designing things and having people use them, and like incorporating like that feedback. And like I'm just kind of like, oh, I'm missing out, or I want to have that experience, or like grow and learn that way as a designer.
One thing that I think is really tricky is when you make a change like that to do different type of work, getting into that new space can be challenging. I think especially right now for a lot of people with the current state of the job market, like it's, chicken or the egg. Like people want the
Yeah.
experience. And so that first role, whether it's going from agency to in-house or whether it's from print to digital or something, like it's still design, but people want that exact experience. How did you navigate that jump? Because you had never worked in a large corporate environment before. You'd only come from small agencies. And so how did you overcome that?
I I don't know. I think I I kind of took advantage of a situation where the the team, or like the product design at the times, wasn't fully mature yet. So maybe they didn't have a lot of these, like they weren't as strict about it. I think because I had done some of that contract work in another part of the company, like I knew some people that could like vouch for me. I think also having like people that work there, or the leader that hired me, have different experience in their career, where they could see like, oh yeah, like I get it, like I've done different things. I think that stuff helps. I don't, it's also like what I tell people now, which I don't know if I did then. It's like how you tell your story, or how like having lots of different experience can be a strength. And it's like, how do you want to set yourself up to say like, hey, I know I've done this before, but here's why that's setting me up to like do really well at this thing. And then later on, like as a hiring manager at the Times and Dropbox, like it helped me like take more risks and chances on those candidates. So maybe finding those other hiring managers that have that experience, who can like get it, like get your experience as well.
That's really interesting. Looking back, when I've made similar transitions in my career, certainly finding hiring managers that have made similar transitions, I think you have a little bit of like that built-in empathy, and they're willing to look a little bit harder at the potential and like some of the skills that you might bring from other areas. That's awesome. So once you started at the Times, what do you feel like was the biggest adjustment that you needed to make going from small agency to large and kind of more traditional organization? Like the Times was not necessarily like a very like modern, like digital native organization. And when you're in a small agency, like you get to try all the new things, work with the latest technology. What was the biggest adjustment that you needed to make yourself?
I'd never worked anywhere that had more than like 8 or 9 people working there, and 3,000 people work there, not just like in New York, but like around the globe. So that was a big adjustment. I think I used to describe myself as like a feral employee or designer. It's like if you took like a feral cat out in the street and like put it in like a nice place, and it just like doesn't know what's going on. I think that was a big adjustment. Like also like with our like studio practice, like we like choose what clients you work for, or then choose to like fire them or not work with them if it wasn't going well. But when you're at a big company and you're a part of like a 60-person 100-person team, like you can't choose who's on your team, or like what people you work with. So I was like, oh, I thought I was like good at working with people, but I actually wasn't that great. I had to really learn because if something was really challenging, I never had to like make it work. Which just bounce out. It's like, oh, I have to actually like make this work with this many people and like get stuff done. And yeah, I think that was the hardest part.
Are there any other sort of adjustments that you feel like you had to make, like going from an 8-person company to a 3,000-person company? Like, what new skills did you have to develop yourself that weren't necessary before?
Just like the soft skills, like the like collaboration skills, like managing up. There was no, I didn't have like I was the boss. Now I have like there's like layers of people you have to like work with. Well, I think another big adjustment was having the studio. It was like a part of my identity as a person, and I was really young. I was in my 20s, and like I don't know if I knew who I was. So it like making that change was also kind of like a big shift in identity, and like it was like leaving one design community to join another, and then there were a lot of people like from that like small studio like independent design community that like didn't get it. Like why would you leave this studio? Like go to Times Square and work in an office building cubicle every day. Which I, like some days I would feel I'd like be in spreadsheets and like what am I doing? So it's like emotionally and like just dealing with that like on a personal level too. It's a big change.
I can see how that could, in some ways, feel like you're taking a few steps back in your career because you're like you said, you're in your 20s, you're running your own studio, you have for years, and you're in this community of other studio owners and you're known, and then you go to some place like the Times, which is a totally different community, and so people don't know you, and now you're probably feeling like a small fish in a pretty big pond. What was that like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I liked it, and I worked there for 6 years, but it was hard at first. But I think anytime you like my, I would have to remind myself like I'm here to like do something new, learn something, or like grow in some way, and like that's gonna immediately when you put yourself in a situation where you're learning, you're doing something new, you're gonna feel like the bottom of the barrel. Like I'm out of my pond, like this is scary, or I don't know what I'm doing. But that's like otherwise if you didn't feel that way, then like you're not growing or learning, right? If you feel like, oh, I know how to do this or I'm comfortable, then like what's the challenge? I guess it felt like that. When I think about other times where I've been like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm trying to learn. It felt like that.
So, like you said, you spent over 6 years at the Times, and over the course of that, your role changed. You continued to advance, and by the end, your role was VP of Design. And so, I think a lot of people would look at that and definitely feel like you had a very successful run at the Times. What was it that you think contributed most to your ability to do that?
I think just like sticking with it, like trying different things. I moved around to different like parts of the like company and like as the products grew, like growing with that. And it changed a lot. So I guess just adapting with that.
What was the
I
first
don't know.
opportunity that you had at the Times to move into any sort of like leadership role?
When I joined, it was just totally flat. We were all ICs and we were most of us were working towards this website redesign of nytimes.com. And like shortly after that or within the same time, the company strategy like shifted to really focus on subscription revenue. And there was a big bet and big investment in product and design. And I remember in one year we hired like 25 designers on our product design team and it like scaled up really fast. So that was like that first moment of like, oh, we're like really scaling and growing and just being there at that time to be like, oh, I'm riding that wave and like growing this, building this team and like moving up like with the expansion.
Other than just one of the folks that was there and kind of stuck around, what else do you feel like you did that made you the right candidate to start to take on those leadership roles as the team grew?
I think I had a point of view about like how to lead that and what we should do and how it should be done. And I was really passionate about it. So I was like really motivated to push it forward and really excited to do that too with some of the stuff we were working on. It was just like I was just really into it and like excited about it and it like I wanted to like oh like we're growing like this team that we're growing and how we're setting it up and the way that we're working. It could be any way we want and that just being like a great opportunity and I was like, "Oh, and I know I have this like vision for how it could be or how we can work together or like who the team should be and just yeah, maybe just being passionate about that."
Laying out that plan and presenting those ideas, is that something that you feel like was maybe unique to you, and or maybe a lot of other people on the team weren't doing that?
No, I think there were other people and were other leaders on that team that had their own that led different parts of the team.
Cool. Okay. Let's see here. When we spoke last, one of the things that you mentioned that was really fun during your time at the Times was working on the acquisition of Wirecutter. Can you tell me more about that? Like, what was your role there, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, that was really fun. Have another revenue stream. And this was at the time when the Times had expanded into the cooking product and like games. And they're like, well, what's the next like thing, new product we can do? And like, where could we expand it? So, like, getting to work really closely with business leaders and people in other disciplines to kind of make that proposal and say, like, hey, here's an opportunity. Like, the time should be in the space of like helping people figure out what to buy. And then, like, we shouldn't build our own. There's a thing that does that. We should just buy them. And then just like seeing like the mechanics of like how a company buys another company and like focused on our readers and users or like how would this work?
Those are like some pretty different skills, like the type of strategy questions that you needed to answer and all that. Do you feel like the skills and the perspective that you learned through the Wirecutter acquisition, like how did you end up using that later in your career?
I think there's like parts of like there's like relationship building. Like I remember like through that acquisition, like the leaders and the owner were kind of wary of like a corporate overlord. And I remember like being like one of the more rock and roll people that they met where they're like, oh, corporations aren't so bad. Like not everyone's like super buttoned up or like I was a way to like use that strength as like a feral person, powerful way. What else did I learn later in my career? I had just how to like get something done at that level and at that complexity and coordinating it like across like so many different disciplines. And then just storytelling, because there was a lot of storytelling like to people internally about like what we'll do with this, like storytelling to the wire cutter of like what's going to happen, how is this going to work, and then telling that story to like our readers and our users of like what is this saying, how does this like work together.
Was that were you involved in a lot of the like external communication around the acquisition and things like that also?
No, that was another team that worked on it, but we at that time, the Times isn't like a tech company that's just buying a bunch of companies. Like it's a really big deal for them to spend that much money. And so it was like, hey, if we're gonna do this, then it has to like you gotta turn it around or like we have to make money on it really quick. And so it was like within 60 days we had to like integrate it or do something or like kind of show that it was like on that path of making our money, like returning on this investment. So being involved in that like internal story of like, hey, we gotta do this, or like all the bringing everyone along for like all the testing and things. And some of this stuff was really simple, like so Wirecutter, like one of the revenue streams is through affiliate revenue. So if you like read about a product and you go to Amazon to buy it, like they get a cut. So it's like, what's that button that takes you to Amazon? Like make it bigger and just like simple like things like that to just like, okay, we have to like, I have to come back in 60 days as leadership and say like, hey, we're on this path and like here's the things that we did that like are like user centric but or good business sense.
60 days is to integrate an acquisition and then turn around and for it to be ROI positive. Like that's pretty aggressive.
Yeah, that's why I'm so proud. Because it was like now that and afterward, because I'd never really been a part of an acquisition, and then later on in my career, like I saw a lot of them, especially at Dropbox, and then I was just like, oh, whoa, what we did was like amazing, a miracle, because what's happening
Yeah.
is different.
So you're at the Times for 6 years through like growing in your role, and you also worked on some pretty big projects. Did you ever feel burnt out along the way?
Honestly, I when I left the Times in 2018, I was really burnt out, and I probably should have took a break then, but I didn't think I could, or I don't know. I had lots of like fears. I talked myself out of it, but I wish I had. And then I definitely like after COVID was totally burnt out and took a year off.
I feel like, everyone sort of experiences burnout in slightly different ways. What was it like for you? What did burnout feel like?
Hmm. I just felt like no matter how small it was just so hard to do. Like replying to an email, just anything just felt like it took so much energy. I also had that like, what was it called? Bedtime revenge, where you don't feel like you have enough time for yourself. So then you like stay up late doom scrolling and you don't get enough sleep and then you're too tired and then even more burnt out like the next day. Like you just can't like take care of yourself because everything just feels like you just are exhausted. You just feel too tired to do anything, even things that you used to love.
Having been through that, do you feel like you've gotten better maybe at like recognizing burnout, maybe in yourself or maybe other people that you talk to? I know you do a lot of reaching out. Like, do you feel like your like antennas up a little bit better on recognizing burnout?
I think it definitely is. And I feel I'm more so I after my year off, I decided to become a coach full time and I'm now a certified coach. And I even decided my partner and I moved to New Mexico. So we live in the mountains and we have like a more chill nature life. So I made a lot of changes to help kind of help me make it through like this next phase of my career. So it's like a lot more like making sure I'm taking care of myself, especially in my new role as a coach where I'm there to like support so many people. Like if I'm not taking care of myself, like how can I help and support other people? And I felt that way as a manager and a leader too. What else? I think just listening to like how you're feeling. Like, oh, I'm tired. Like, why am like what's making me tired? Is it because like I went for a run or is it something else? And just like trying to gain more awareness of like what you're feeling in that moment and like trying to be like, okay, if I'm tired because I was coaching all day, like let's have like an aftercare plan. Or I'm getting really stressed about the election. Just another like PTSD of working in a newsroom as well. So like just last week, I made all these election aftercare plans for like election day and that weekend after for what I'm gonna do to take care of myself because I just know it's gonna like stress me out. So it's just like thinking ahead, like knowing like, okay, this is gonna be taxing. Like how am I gonna take care of myself?
Wow. So going from, through the end of maybe the end of your time at the Times and then through Dropbox, like looking back, it sounds like maybe you're realizing that you went a few years into like feeling burnt out without doing something about it. And then now it sounds like you've made a lot of life changes centered around like your mental health and you've moved, you've a very different career and you have like all these techniques that you've developed. I feel like that's a lot of growth. Like that's a very different person from like someone who's sort of like grits their teeth through burnout for too long to like having a very fairly sophisticated plan of how to take care of yourself. Where did that come from? Like how did you develop that awareness or like just knowing how to do these things?
Yeah, it came from. like living through COVID was a big eye opener and shift in my perspective of like, hey, what actually matters? Or what what is my relationship to ambition or what value? How is this serving me as a person? It really put things into perspective, like being stuck at home and like I don't know if you remember like at the beginning of COVID, it was really scary when we didn't have vaccines and like people were getting sick and dying. And I lost my mom during COVID and that just like was like what like it really put things into perspective of like how short our lives are and like we could do anything. You can do anything. And like what so like I'm choosing to be here, like or I'm choosing to like go work at this job or do this. Like is this it, like the choice I want to make? And those things change over time because that those answers, if I would have asked myself in my 20s or my 30s, would have been totally different than the answers that I got asking myself those questions like now in my early 40s of like what actually matters and what I want to focus on. And
Hmm.
that's fine because then maybe like in 10 years I'll change again and be like, no, now I want to do this and like I want to go back to like a big job. And that's like we are working like you're working for like 40, 50 years. Like you're working for a long time. You can't, it won't be the same. And so that's just like embracing that, like it can, I don't know, for me, just like focusing on like, what do I need right now? And then optimizing for that. And then knowing that maybe that'll shift.
There's so much of that resonates. I mean, for all of the like uncertainty and everything else that came with the pandemic, getting this sort of like very drastic change in like lifestyle and like the stark juxtaposition of like before versus after was like right there in front of you. And so I think for a lot of people that was suddenly gave them a very different perspective on things like what they're doing with their life or their career or things like that. So you are now in this new chapter of your career that a lot of it is sort of centered around taking care of yourself and being a little bit more aware of like what you need and what you want out of this part of your career. What do you see the next few years for you to be like? Like what are you hoping to get out of it?
I want to have a hobby because I've never had a hobby before because I just worked too hard. Yeah, and I want to I just got my coaching certification earlier this year. So I want to continue like working with people one on one and helping be more designers like through their burnouts and career pivots. But another thing I really loved at Dropbox and the New York Times was helping people become managers and leaders for the first time. So I'm kind of hoping to find more clients, coaching clients that want support on that path. And then yeah, just making more time to be outside and be with my family and like having like not living to work or working to live, but having these things kind of be in more harmony and having the work I do be something that like energizes me to do other stuff at work and then like that energizing me to like do my work and I'm still figuring it out.
Well, I think even just describing the decisions that you've made so far and like what you've set up for yourself and what you've accomplished, I think there's a lot of people out there right now who are aspiring to get there, like making that. They've been working in corporate for several years and they're looking for that change. What advice would you have for someone who's maybe considering that same change or wants to be able to make the change that you've made in your life?
I think it was something I probably wanted to do for a long time, but just didn't like was too scared to take the risk. There's like this little voice that is in our head that tries to keep us safe and doesn't care if we're fulfilled or not. And it's just like, no, don't do that. Like, how will you afford it? Like, what if nothing happens? I'd say just do it and then trust yourself that if it doesn't work, that you'll just figure it out because you've figured out other things, gone through other challenges, and like gotten this far. So, and then, or like it just might work out.
Awesome. I think that's such a great note to wrap this up on. Thank you so much for joining. Where can people find you online?
Coach.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, thanks again, Renda. Thanks for joining.
Thanks.
Cool.
Thanks for having me. I had a fun time.
And that wraps up our conversation with Renda Morton. What an incredible journey. From the bold move to leave her own studio behind to her insights on avoiding burnout, there's so much to take away from her story. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on our next episode, where we'll dive into another fascinating career path in the world of UX design. Thanks for watching. I'm Chris Abad, and we'll see you next time on Pixelated Path.